Well, final topic for today is Binance. Binance, obviously, they've launched their decentralized exchange, and they've become this industry titan, and it's happened so quickly. So, what are your kind of thoughts on Binance? Do you think that it's good to have so much power in the hands of one exchange player? What are your thoughts about them in general?
Well, I think I don't like when people talk about these monopolies and how they need to be broken up and they have too much power. And I think as long as there is no government enforced monopoly, then there's no barrier to entry and people can compete. Binance is where it is because it provides a great service. And there are other exchanges if you prefer different things, if you want to have more accountability, if you want lower fees, if there are different choices in the marketplace. And I really don't mind that Binance has a huge amount of market share. I think that's totally fine. And I think what's interesting to me about Binance is I'm not saying that oh, they're the greatest, oh, hail Binance, yeah, there's nothing wrong with them, because it is an interesting situation. But from what I can see, they're making moves towards becoming this kind of decentralized entity. Right? Like the fact that they're doing a lot of jurisdictional arbitrage, they're moving different sectors all over the world, depending on different laws. So they're partly based here and partly based there. And that is a way of them kind of mitigating the leverage that government can put on the institution. If you're just based in China and China decides, actually, we're going to nationalize this. Well, they can't if part of it's actually based in Malta and part of it's actually based elsewhere. There's less power that government has to exert pressure. So I like that they've kind of safeguarded themselves, but that's something that, Apple and Google have been doing for a really long time as well. But now they've just released this decentralized exchange, which was ahead of schedule. And that's interesting as well, because I like the idea that people are moving towards more decentralized environments. And Binance doesn't need to do that. They're this giant exchange that gets a huge amount of business. People like it. They're providing a great service. And yet they're not looking at, okay, let's just keep doing more of what we're doing to get more money. They're thinking of, okay, what's the future going to look like? Where do we need to be heading? I think they recognize the risks of government. I think they recognize the risks of other institutional players. They're trying to safeguard that. And if they can get, I see a lot of competing decentralized exchanges out there. There are huge amounts of problems to be solved in terms of liquidity, in terms of speed. There are all kinds of issues when you have something that's decentralized, because centralization gets rid of a lot of that friction. And I think that Binance, because it is so large, it kind of, if they can bring in that liquidity because they already have such a huge consumer base, and if they're encouraging people to use these Binance tokens, even on the centralized side of things, and that helps to create the liquidity as well, that's a really interesting route that I'm going to be watching very closely.
I like too how they've actually taken a big focus on trying to bring a wider array of markets in. I mean, it really said a lot to me when their first fiat exchange was in Uganda, of all places. And
Was it really?
yeah, it was, and it's not a big market. It's still not a big market for Binance by any means, but that was pretty cool because they
Yeah.
could have easily said, just go to the EU first or something like that, and they have got to the EU now, and they're looking at Argentina. I think is probably going to be one of the next ones, and I think another five fiat jurisdictions are going to roll out this year for Binance. So yeah, you're right. It's really interesting to see them actually delivering this stuff and just continue to be such an innovator in the space. And I
Yeah.
look at so much what's going on in the exchange scene overall, and it's almost always a result of something that Binance is doing or has done. We look at the current IEO boom. That didn't
Right.
start until Binance kind of started doing it again. And then every exchange within about 6 weeks had announced that they're going to have their own IEO platform and all this stuff. And it all started with Binance.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting how they continue to be this industry leader. And that's a tough thing to do in an industry with so much innovation and so much competition. But we realized then that most of the exchanges, they're just there making money, following the program. And if someone else tells them the program is changing, well, that's what they do.
I think that people unnecessarily look down on successful companies as well. You have something that
Yeah.
gets a lot of customers and provides a lot of value that people are using, and they grow really large because a lot of people want to be on that platform. Suddenly you have people start to turn up their noses and say like, oh, it's too big and it's dangerous and it's centralized. And they start to you hear this rhetoric, which I completely disagree with. First of all, don't hate something because it's provided value and has grown large. From what I can tell, Binance isn't doing that by creating this direct line of credit with the Federal Reserve, right? Which is what JP Morgan has done, which is what Citibank has. So let's not hate a company for being successful. Furthermore, let's just make a distinction between government enforced monopolies and companies that have just gained a lot of power, right? Because right now we're looking at companies like Facebook that have amassed a lot of power. And people are talking about breaking that up and all of that and how that's all bad. But you also see what's happening with Facebook is their reputation's also going down the toilet. Far fewer people are using it. You look at their earnings reports every quarter that come out and they get worse and worse. Facebook is not doing well and they're self-sabotaging, and they're not a threat to people the way that people think of it. They think, oh, they're so big and they have too much control. It's like, you can just stop using their product, right? And people do stop using their product and then they lose their market share. You don't need government to come in and break them up. So I think that we need to be really careful to avoid this narrative of thinking that because something's big, it's bad. When you have the government amassing the power, it's a very different situation. Government power is backed up by the use of force, which is backed up by, putting people in jail with pointing a gun at your head type thing, right? You don't want someone who can force people to do things to ever amass too much power. But then when you have private companies, I think that's a different situation as long as you don't have the force of government backing them up. If they end up creating a shitty product, they'll probably go downhill unless they're getting subsidized, unless they're getting pushed up by politicians, unless they're getting special favors or handouts. They're probably not going to last if they're not providing good service. So I don't think it's something to necessarily be worried about right now.
It's funny, you just described so much of the economy, all these businesses that shouldn't be competitive anymore but get subsidies, bribe politicians and all this stuff. Well, that's the great part about the crypto economy right now, is that we don't have a too big to fail backed by a government kind of cryptocurrency exchange, right? That would be incredibly problematic. And we take it right back to the start of our conversation, those Wall Street institutions and things like this. I mean, what's going to happen in 10 years when we have, the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ and Fidelity and all these guys, and they start doing paper trading of Bitcoin, right? And they issue out, more products than exist, and then those get called in, and then they go to the government and say, oh, we're too big to fail. We've gambled massively and we lost money again. And we need you to do this. And
that's what we don't want to see. But talking about this sort of decentralized nature of Binance, one more thing that I do want to mention is what's happening with Japan at the moment. So they've got their G20 summit, and apparently they've written this I guess you could call it guidance on cryptocurrency that they're issuing to all these countries. And they obviously have the privilege to set a lot of the agenda when they're hosting. And so they've set it looking at cryptocurrency saying, listen, we should all get on the same page with regulation. We should have uniform regulation across the world. And that to me is kind of scary territory, because right now one of the perks of cryptocurrency is that it's across borders. You have this kind of anarchy of different world powers in this balancing act that are competing with each other. And it's in our best interests to let them compete, because then we'll always have an option at the end of the day. If America's terrible, then you can move somewhere else and try and have better laws. But if everyone starts to get on the same page with cryptocurrency, and suddenly by some miracle everyone's like, yes, let's all treat this exactly the same way, then it's a little bit dangerous to say the least. We definitely don't want countries being on the same page with cryptocurrency. We want them to compete. As we said, we don't want Malta to just be like, okay, New York, we'll go use your guidelines. We'll treat cryptocurrency the same way you have. So it does worry me that Japan is looking in that direction, and maybe it's because they do see the threat. As long as certain jurisdictions around the world accept this and support this, it can never really be killed. It's this global phenomenon for this global marketplace. So I really do see governments being backed into a corner at the moment with how they're dealing with cryptocurrency and wanting to see how they can then fix this situation.
It's interesting as well, because Japan has been quite a positive player in a lot of aspects when it comes to Obviously, it's the home in so many ways of the Bitcoin markets. I mean, that's one of the biggest markets for Bitcoin outside of the U.S. dollar. And interesting, of course, the U.S. dollar doesn't just account for the U.S., right? It's the international trading instrument for Bitcoin, but the yen's the second biggest market, and that's very Japan specific,
And for
right?
a
But
while, the yen actually was ahead of the US dollar. That was quite incredible when that happened.
yeah, absolutely. And so we've seen Japan kind of trying to go with a route of like, we want to enable the best of the cryptocurrency industry while trying to avoid the worst of it. And it's a really tricky situation again. And I guess we just have to wait and see what Japan actually proposes at the G20, because if they could agree on something like, none of us are going to ban cryptocurrency, that would generally be a positive thing, right? But again, it's just, that's not what it's going to be. Let's
No,
keep it
that's
real.
not.
It's all going to be about KYC and AML and compliance to regulations and all this stuff. And it starts becoming a bit dirty at that point.
Yeah, and it's if you start, I mean, you were talking before about sanctions and about how the US government is forcing different countries like Japan, say, listen, you have to buy oil from us, or you have to use US dollar, or all of these things. And if you don't, then if you buy from Iran, then you're going to get sanctioned. And these are the types of things that happen with governments bullying each other and saying you have to abide by these rules, or we're going to hurt you economically. And America has a huge amount of leverage with countries all over the world. So I do worry about the potential outcome of them using that leverage to the detriment of cryptocurrency. That being said, I don't see the US government as being this institution. Like, it's not a single entity, right? It's made up of all kinds of different government departments that want to treat cryptocurrency a whole bunch of different ways. There are a bunch of self-interested individuals in all of those departments. Some of them are probably involved in cryptocurrency.
Mm-hmm.
We know Ben Lawsky is. He created the BitLicense, then that wonderful revolving door of cronyism. He just jumped straight onto the board of Ripple, right? So there are definitely self-interested people out there. And I think as long as you have that sort of balancing act, then maybe not too much damage is going to be created, the same way that we couldn't get the Fed audited, because you had Barney Frank, and you had these people who very much in their self-interest not to have that happen, who are lobbying against audits and that sort of thing. So I think, that being said, like, it just kind of is a testament to the robustness of cryptocurrency, in that it really does play. It's not just about the tech, it's about this kind of game theory as well. And there are all of these individual incentives that come into play that make this robust system. So that makes me really bullish about it, about its longevity, and just always seeing a use case for something that can't be controlled by any single individual.
And it's powerful. It's powerful when you actually start to see it work in real life. When you start to see countries actually, who are supposed to be cut out of the international financial system using this kind of technology, when you see individual players who are using this technology, when you see lifelines opened up to like Venezuela, for example, and that's amazing, because the sanctions just keep getting tougher and life just keeps getting harder. And look, let's keep it real. It's not that the entire country of Venezuela, all the citizens have access to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, but there's a niche.
Yeah.
And that niche is powerful. And that niche proves a very interesting point, a point that will only become more salient for more countries as we do see this kind of financial tyranny continue to reign across the globe. Cryptocurrency will be there as this kind of shining beacon of hope for all these people out there.
Yeah, for sure. We can hope and dream, can't we? But I definitely am glad it exists, because there's so many more possibilities now than we ever had before. Like I often say, I think this is the biggest step towards freedom we've taken in the last 100 years. I think that this is huge. This is paradigm shifting. No one's talking about it because they don't want to admit it. They don't want to admit the power that decentralized technologies have. But when you have things that don't need people's permission in order to function, because they can function in a decentralized manner all over the globe, that's real power right there. No one's really talking about it. Governments don't want to admit that they don't need to grant permission anymore, that people can do things outside of their jurisdiction. But that's the world that we're moving towards. And I think that the sooner we accept that, the sooner we can figure out a good reaction to that, make better choices than pretending that we still have some semblance of control.
That's it. Someone who I think really understands this is Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF. And it's so bad because she's working for the bad guys, but I feel like she's this really clever and intelligent lady that actually gets it, But she's like, I get it, but we need to, do something about it.
Don't look behind the curtain, guys. Look over here. Yeah.
Anyway, this has been a super, super interesting chat. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about cryptocurrencies. It's always a great time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Always great luck.